The night before the Culmination Trials, Cadet did not sleep. This was not unusual. His species, the Vreth, managed their rest in 4-minute intervals distributed across a standard cycle. A biological efficiency that the Academy nutritionists had recorded, marveled at, and then quietly factored into the scheduling of final week drills. He did not need extended unconsciousness. He needed time, and tonight time was what he had. He sat at the desk in his solo quarters on the third tier of Cadet Block 7, where senior-ranking competitors were afforded private rooms as a function of their academic standing. Careth's standing was second in the cohort. He had been second for 11 months. The margin that separated him from first was not a gap in scores or in physical performance metrics. It was a single name entered on the board above his own, in the clean block letters that the Academy's ranking system used for all cadets, regardless of species. Reyes, D. Damon Reyes, human, transfer from some secondary institution on a planet that barely qualified for interstellar travel. A species that had been in galactic space for less than a century. A species that was supposed to be here for the experience, for the diplomatic optics, for the gesture, not to lead the board. Careth turned away from the window and looked at the ranking board display on his wall, a courtesy projection he'd kept active for 11 months as a source of motivation. He had told himself on the first day that looking at it every night would make him faster. That was what he'd told himself. He reached up and switched it off. The room went darker. On his desk lay the materials for tomorrow. The Culmination Trials were the final examination of the 3-year program. Not a written test, not a simulator, but a live field evaluation on the Vethara Plateau, a stretch of terrain the Academy maintained in a state of deliberate hostility. Variable gravity wells, electromagnetic disruption corridors, active toxin dispersal zones, and 3 rotating scenarios that cadets learned about only at the moment they dropped in. No equipment beyond what was issued at the jump-off. No communication with instructors once the trial began. No extraction until the scenario concluded or a cadet's distress beacon activated. Distress beacons ended careers. Not formally. The Academy's official documentation said only that beacon activation resulted in immediate scenario, termination, and mandatory medical review. But everyone in the program understood what it meant in practice. A cadet who activated a beacon left the Culmination Trials with a record annotation that followed them through every posting, every assignment, every promotion board for the rest of their service life. No one who had activated a beacon had risen above field station level in 37 years of the program's history. Careth had never activated a beacon. He did not intend to. He reviewed the documents on his desk one more time. Not because he needed to, but because the act of reviewing was itself a preparation. He knew the plateau's topography from 3 months of cartography study. He knew the standard scenario variations from 6 months of tactical modeling, mapping the Academy's design logic until he could predict with 73% accuracy which combination the proctors would select for any given cohort composition. He knew his own body's performance envelope across each terrain type, each gravity deviation, each toxin class, calibrated to a precision most cadets didn't bother with. He knew the human's performance envelope too. This was perhaps the thing that bothered him most in the quiet hours of the night before the trials. He had spent an extraordinary amount of effort understanding Damon Reyes, more than he had spent understanding any other competitor, more, probably, than was strategically necessary. He could justify it as intelligence gathering. Know your rivals, know their patterns, know where the gap in their armor lives. He had justified it that way for 11 months. But there were 4 cadets between himself and Reyes on the overall board, and he did not know their performance envelopes with anywhere near the same granularity. He did not track their sleep schedules, or note the meals they selected from the commissary, or catalog the small adjustments they made to their equipment loadouts between training runs. He had done all of those things for Reyes and had told himself it was strategy. Tonight, in the quiet, he was honest enough to call it something else. It was obsession. And obsession was inefficient. He had tried, in the early months, to determine where Reyes's ceiling was. Every competitor had a ceiling, the threshold above which the demands exceeded their physiology, their training density, their cognitive architecture. Careth's own ceiling was measurably high, and he had spent 3 years systematically pressing against it from every angle. He had expected to find Reyes's ceiling within the first 2 months, when the program's notorious attrition phase was designed to reveal structural weaknesses. 40% of each cohort washed out in months 2 and 3. 38 of the 112 cadets who had entered with Caret's cohort were gone before the midpoint exam. Reyes was not among them. Caret had expected to find the ceiling in months 4 through 6, during the sustained operations phase, the period the instructors designed to test not peak performance but extended performance, the ability to maintain function across multiple days of accumulated stress, degraded rations, irregular rest, and compounding environmental demands. Reyes's species was new to this level of training. They hadn't been in galactic space long enough to develop the physiological optimizations that older species carried as genetic baseline. Their bodies were dense and warm-blooded and peculiarly dependent on atmospheric oxygen in ways that made sustained high-altitude operations theoretically punishing. Theoretically. In practice, Caret had watched Reyes complete a 72-hour navigation exercise across the mountain terrain with the kind of incremental, grinding steadiness that reminded him of geological processes, not fast, not flashy, but operating on a different scale of stubbornness than anything the evaluation metrics were designed to measure. The human didn't outperform the top Vreth cadets on any single metric across that exercise. He didn't need to. He just kept going when others stopped, kept making small correct decisions when others started making large incorrect ones, and arrived at the extraction point with his objective completed and his biometrics inside normal range, while 2 of the highest-rated cadets in the cohort were on medical review. That was the moment Caret had begun tracking him properly. He stood now and moved to the window, looking out over Cadet Block 7's central yard. The other blocks were visible beyond. Block 4, Block 2, the newer construction of Block 9. Somewhere in Block 4, Reyes had a room in the shared accommodation tier for mid-ranking cadets. He would not be sleeping now either, Caret judged, not the night before culmination. Most cadets didn't. The tension was too high, the stakes too clear. He wondered what Reyes did in the hours before a major trial. He had seen the human in the practice yards at odd hours, early morning before the scheduled runs, sometimes late after the formal training day was done. Not drilling exactly. Caret had observed him across the yard on 3 separate occasions, doing something that looked more like maintenance. Checking equipment with the slow, methodical attention of someone running through a known list. Replacing a friction pad on a line descent tool, verifying the calibration on a pressure suit seal, not rehearsing techniques, not running simulations. Just making sure the tools were ready. Caret had noted this with a kind of reluctant respect that he immediately distrusted. It was sensible preparation. It was the kind of thing the Academy's pre-trial briefings recommended, but most cadets skipped because the Academy's equipment was maintained to specification, and only an obsessive or a paranoid would double-check it. Reyes did it anyway, every time before a major evaluation. His gear failure rate was 0 across 3 years. The cohort average was 4%. The window showed the central yard below, lit by the Academy's ambient night cycle, a low blue-white glow designed to support nocturnal capable species without disrupting the biological rhythms of species that required extended darkness. Caret watched a maintenance drone cross the yard at low altitude, running its nightly check of the groundside installations. He thought about the Culmination Trials extraction scenario. If he could predict the variant, and he believed his probability model gave him a workable edge, he had already pre-positioned his thinking around the 2 most likely configurations. He ran through them again, not with urgency, just verification. The data was locked. He thought about Reyes. He thought about the month 4 incident, which he had never discussed with anyone, but which he had replayed in his memory more times than he would admit. The tactical training exercise on Recon Platform 6, a simulated boarding action with live countermeasures. Caret had been squad lead for the primary insertion team. Reyes had been assigned to the secondary team, supporting role, no independent objectives. The exercise had gone wrong when the platform's countermeasure AI escalated faster than the design spec called for. A known malfunction that proctors had deliberately left in place as an unannounced variable. The secondary insertion point was sealed by an active EM burst before the secondary team reached it. Standard protocol under those conditions was to signal primary lead and await redirect instructions. Reyes had not waited. He had rerouted his team through the maintenance crawlway beneath the platform's main deck, a route that was not in the exercise briefing because it was technically outside the designated operational area, reached the primary objective from below, created a suppression window from an angle the countermeasure AI wasn't calibrated to cover, and extracted with the objective item 12 seconds before the exercise hard timer expired. The proctors had spent 90 minutes reviewing the footage before they logged the outcome. The rules were technically ambiguous about the crawlway. It was labeled as infrastructure, not operational space. They ultimately credited the secondary team's action as a valid solution. They also noted the deviation in Reyes's record, neither as praise nor as censure, simply as a data point. Cadet had watched the debrief footage 4 times. The human hadn't broken the rules. He had found the edge of them and operated there, with the confidence of someone who understood that the rules were a framework, not a ceiling. This was the thing Cadet found most difficult to catalog. It wasn't physical capability. He could explain and work around that. It wasn't tactical knowledge. Knowledge was acquirable, and Caret's knowledge density was objectively higher than Reyes's across most of the program's assessed domains. It was something else, a kind of structural comfort with uncertainty, a refusal to freeze at the edge of the known. Most cadets, when the ground beneath their assumptions gave way, stopped moving and recalculated. Reyes recalculated while moving, and his recalculations were usually right. Cadet did not know how to train for that. He did not know if it was trainable. He turned from the window and sat back at the desk. The Culmination Trials would begin at the 6th hour. He had approximately 4 standard hours remaining until the pre-trial assembly. He would run his sleep intervals in precise distribution across those hours, log a calibration note on his physical metrics at the 3-hour mark, and be at the assembly point 10 minutes ahead of the required arrival. He picked up the only personal item on his desk, a small carved token, dense gray stone the size of his palm. He had carried it from home. His instructor father had pressed it into his hands at the departure ceremony and said the kind of thing Vreth fathers said at departures, that the weight of the stone was the weight of what Cadet carried with him, that it would remind him of what he was for. Cadet had carried it because it was true, and because his instructor father was the one who had first told him, at age 4, that second place was a position, not a destination. He set it down. He ran his first sleep interval. When he woke, the room was the same. The display was still dark. Outside, the yard was quieter. The late-cycle maintenance drones had passed. He ran his calibration note, verified his biometrics, and lay in the careful stillness of a body being managed toward a known standard. He thought, without intending to, about the bunkroom confrontation in month 2. He had engineered that badly. He had seen by month 2 that Reyes was going to be a problem for the rankings, and he had made the error of letting that register as a personal problem rather than a competitive one. He had organized a pressure campaign among the mid-tier cadets, nothing that left a formal record, just the routine social geography of a competitive cohort, the wrong bunk assignments, the delayed equipment allocations, the exclusion from the informal study networks that mid-ranking cadets use to share notes on upcoming evaluations. It was not uncommon behavior in this program, and it was rarely investigated unless it produced a formal complaint. Reyes had not filed a complaint. He had also not bent. He had found alternative study resources, had adjusted to the suboptimal equipment without complaint or visible frustration, had built a parallel informal network among the other human cadets and 3 or 4 aliens from species that were also operating at the margins of the cohort's social structure. Cadet had watched this unfold and had felt, with a precision that embarrassed him in retrospect, that it was somehow worse than if the human had simply broken. An adversary who breaks is a resolved problem. An adversary who doesn't is a constant variable. He ran his second sleep interval. At the 3-hour mark he rose, calibrated, and began the slow, careful process of suiting up for the culmination trial. The standard issue kit was minimal, base layer, environmental seal, equipment harness, the issued tools in their designated positions. He moved through the sequence with the same attention he always brought to preparation. He did not rush the seals or skip the verification steps. He had 4 hours of margins and he used every step of it. He thought about what it would mean if Reyes finished first tomorrow. It would mean something to Caret's record, though not catastrophically. Second in a cohort, this competitive was an excellent result by any objective measure. It would mean something to the Academy's instructors who had been observing Reyes with the specific, careful attention that institutions give to things that don't fit their models. It would mean something to the human species, though Caret couldn't fully calculate the scope of that. Humans seemed to attach a particular weight to firsts and records and demonstrations of capability in new arenas, something about their relatively short history in galactic space, making each data point carry more than proportional significance. But mostly, Caret had come to understand tonight it would mean something to him. Something that was not about rankings. He had spent 11 months watching a being he had assigned to a category, competitor, obstacle, anomaly to be eliminated from the head of the board, and had incrementally accumulated evidence that the category was wrong. Not wrong because Reyes was more than a competitor. Wrong because the category was the problem. Because reducing someone to an obstacle was a way of not looking at them, and Caret had been looking very carefully at Damon Reyes for a very long time. The 6th hour came. He went to the assembly point. The assembly was held in the pre-drop bay, a broad, low-ceilinged room beneath the plateau's western approach ridge. 74 cadets in full kit, standing in cohort order, facing the proctor panel. The room smelled of recycled atmosphere and equipment sealant and the particular psychochemical signature that most species exude when they are quietly afraid. Caret's olfactory system registered all of it and cataloged none of it. He focused on the panel. Proctor Vacheline stood at the center, a Tharani, narrow and tall, with the flat silver lenses that Tharani used in high illumination environments. She had run Culmination Trials for 19 years. She did not look like she had run them for 19 years. She looked like the trial ran her, like it was the fixed point and she moved around it. Scenario 7, she said, and let the words settle before continuing. Simultaneous infrastructure collapse and hostile incursion. You will distinguish between the two and manage both without conflating them into a single operational response. Point of failure, assuming the incursion caused the collapse. The collapse is independent. Your scenario materials are uploading to your kit displays now. Cadets are not permitted to discuss these materials with each other from this moment until the trial concludes. Distress beacon protocols apply. Good luck is not applicable. Good preparation is. She stepped back. The panel's data feeds activated. Caret's kit display populated with the scenario map, the insertion coordinates, the known hazard grid for Sector 3 of the plateau. He had run probability models against Scenario 7 as one of his top 3 predicted variants. The data confirmed what his model had expected. He felt, briefly, a clean satisfaction that had nothing to do with Reyes. He looked for the human anyway. Reyes was 12 positions to Caret's right in the assembly line, standing in the standard at-ease posture that the Academy required. Feet spaced, hands behind, eyes forward. He had the same kit as every other cadet, the same harness configuration, the same beacon unit in its chest mount position. He was reading his kit display with the same expression he brought to most things, unhurried, attentive, like he was reading something interesting, rather than something that would determine the arc of his career. Caret returned to his own display. The drop sequence ran at the 7th hour. Cadets deployed from individual acceleration tubes at staggered intervals, 30 seconds between each launch, preventing clustering at the drop zone. This was deliberate. The Culmination Trial was not a team exercise, and the scenario was designed to punish cadets who tried to operate in informal clusters rather than handling their assigned sectors independently. Caret's insertion point was Grid Sector 3 Alpha, on the eastern edge of the plateau's first gravity deviation zone. He hit the surface running, adjusted his gait to the 17% gravity compression that the deviation produced, and oriented to the scenario map inside 4 seconds. The infrastructure collapse was already in progress. He could see the effects from his landing position, a chain of thermal venting events along the plateau's central ridge, the kind of cascade that happened when the Academy's engineers cut the thermal management feeds to a subsection and let the underlying geology express itself. The venting was real, not simulated. The cadets wore full environmental protection, but the terrain they had to cross was actively hostile in the literal sense. Superheated columns of pressurized gas erupting at irregular intervals along the ridge, the ground around the vents too hot for extended contact. The incursion component was visible from the same position. 3 autonomous security units, the Academy called them evaluators, the cadets called them hunters, had deployed from concealed positions in the north face of the plateau and were moving on convergent vectors toward the scenario's central objective, a signal relay station at the plateau's high point, Grid Sector 5. The evaluators were not weapon-bearing, but they were obstacle-bearing. Physical intercept capability that could push a cadet into a hazard zone, commandeer the relay station's access controls, and lock down the objective before a cadet could complete it. Standard approach was to address the evaluators first, and then move to the objective. This was the conflation error the Proctor had warned against. Addressing the evaluators first meant moving toward them, which meant crossing the thermal vent zone while they were still active and mobile. Exactly the scenario the thermal cascade had created. The correct read was to use the thermal cascade as a geographic constraint on the evaluators. Movement vectors funnel them toward the ridge's 2 passable corridors and reach the relay station from the west approach, while the evaluators were still navigating around the venting columns. Kareth confirmed the read in 11 seconds and moved. He was not the first cadet to move. He could see 3 others already in motion in his sector. Cadet Dreveth from the Lossian cohort, who was fast but predictable. Cadet Varric Sol, a Vreth, from a different clan line who had been 3rd in the rankings for 8 months. And someone he couldn't immediately identify at this distance, moving along the western approach corridor at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, but absolutely consistent. He identified Reyes by the way he moved before he was close enough to confirm the kit number. The human was taking the western approach. It was the same read Kareth had made, which was either coincidence or evidence that Reyes had run probability models of his own. It was also, Kareth noted as he adjusted his own vector, a more conservative route. The western approach was longer by approximately 400 meters, but avoided 2 of the active vent clusters entirely. The eastern direct route, which Kareth had intended to use, was shorter but required timing too. Vent windows and crossing 40 meters of high-heat ground. Kareth kept his own route. The timing was manageable. He had the data. The first vent window gave him 11 seconds. He crossed in 8. The heat was significant even through the environmental layer. Not dangerous, but present. The kind of physical input that demanded processing bandwidth and reduced higher cognitive function. This was the plateau's design logic. Make the environment expensive enough that cadets were running on reduced capacity by the time the real decisions came. Kareth had accounted for this in his preparation. He held his route decisions pre-committed through the heat zone, so he wasn't making new decisions. Under load. The second vent was already cycling when he reached it. He held at the safety perimeter, watched the column peak and begin to drop, crossed when the thermal sensors on his kit showed the ground temperature falling through the green threshold. The crossing took 5 seconds. He was on the far side and moving before the vent cycled again. From the ridge approach, he could see the relay station's upper structure. He could also see that Cadet Varric had taken the eastern route and was now stopped at the second vent perimeter, waiting for a window that was taking longer than expected to open. The plateau's thermal behavior was variable in ways that probability models captured imperfectly. Kareth had known this and had built margin into his scenario time. Varric had not. The evaluators were visible from the ridge approach. 2 of them had reached the north corridor and were moving in the expected pattern. The third had taken an unexpected vector, moving along the plateau's secondary ridge, a route that hadn't been in Kareth's probability model because the Academy's historical data suggested evaluators avoided that terrain under thermal cascade conditions. This one wasn't avoiding it. He updated his model in real time. The third evaluator would reach the relay station's eastern access point approximately 40 seconds before Karath reached the western one at his current pace. Not in time to lock the objective, but in time to create an intercept problem at the station perimeter. He increased pace. He was 300 meters from the relay station when he saw Reyes go down. The western approach corridor had a section where the gradient dropped sharply before leveling at the station's foundation platform. It was passable. Hundreds of cadets had passed it in training runs over the years, but the thermal cascade had changed the ground conditions. Steam and condensate from the vent columns had tracked along the plateau's surface topology and settled in the low sections of the corridor. The surface had become a thin film of condensed water over superheated rock, and in the lower gravity of the deviation zone, the standard friction assumptions were wrong. Reyes's left boot hit the section at an angle. The slip was fast and controlled in the first half second. Karath could see the human's body make the automatic adjustment, weight redistribution, hands out, the proprioceptive response of a person who had spent time on unstable ground. What the automatic response couldn't compensate for was the equipment harness cable that had snagged on a fractured rock edge to the side of the corridor. The cable wasn't load-bearing. It was the secondary tether for the kit pack, but snagged at that angle under that momentum. It arrested the fall correction and turned what would have been a recoverable slip into a full contact impact with the corridor wall. Karath heard the sound across the distance, dull, dense, the specific acoustic signature of a body hitting rock at speed. He stopped. This was not a tactical decision. He simply stopped, and in the fraction of a second that followed, he performed a calculation that he would spend the next several days analyzing. The third evaluator was closing on the station's eastern access. Varixol was still held at the vent perimeter. Karath was the only cadet in range of the western approach. If he continued on his current vector, he would reach the relay station with enough margin to lock the primary objective before the evaluator reached the eastern access. This was, by every metric the Academy used, the correct decision. The Culmination Trials design specifically prohibited external assistance. Cadets could not render aid to competitors without incurring an objective invalidating notation on their record. The rules were explicit and had been explicit for 37 years. He looked at Reyes. The human was against the corridor wall, not moving, not activating a beacon either. Karath's kit display showed the beacon registry for all cadets in his sector, a courtesy feed the Academy provided to prevent accidental deaths in a trial that was designed to be difficult but not lethal, and Reyes's beacon was inactive. That meant the human was either conscious and choosing not to activate or unconscious and unable to. Neither scenario was Karath's problem. He started moving toward the relay station. He covered 30 meters before he stopped again. He did not stop because of the rules or the notation or what it would mean for his record. He stopped because of something that had no tactical weight and no place in the probability models he had built over 11 months. He stopped because he had spent 11 months studying the being who was currently lying against a corridor wall on the Vethara Plateau, and he knew, with a specificity that was the product of that study, that if the positions were reversed, if it was Karath against the wall and Reyes 30 meters away with a clear path to the objective, Reyes would not continue to the relay station. He knew this the way he knew data. He had watched Reyes for 11 months. He had seen him pull a Laotian cadet out of a sparring simulator malfunction in month 7 at personal cost to his own exercise score. He had seen him share ration supplements with the Duresi cadets who were struggling with the commissary's atmospheric composition limitations without being asked and without making a point of it. He had seen him, in month 9, take the full weight of a collapsed training scaffold off a junior cadet who had wandered into the equipment yard, a cadet from Karath's own study, Network, one of the cadets Karath had used in his pressure campaign, and hold it there for 40 seconds until 2 instructors arrived. He had never asked Karath for anything in return, and he had never mentioned the incident. Karath had never mentioned it either. He had noted it. It had been another data point that didn't fit the model. He turned around. He went back down the western approach corridor at a run, and when he reached Reyes, he found the human conscious, sitting against the wall with his right hand braced against the rock and his left hand pressed to his side where the harness impact had hit. His face was the color things go when pain is being processed internally, distributed across the body's systems rather than the notation, Reyes said immediately, not a greeting, a warning. His voice was level, which was extraordinary given what Karath's sensors were reading from the ambient biometric feed. I am aware of the notation, Karath said. The evaluator will lock the eastern access in approximately 35 seconds. I am also aware of that. Reyes looked at him for a moment with the same expression Karath had catalogued many times at a distance, unhurried, attentive. At close range, it was more specific than it had appeared across a yard or a training floor. It was the expression of someone who was genuinely present in the current moment, processing what was actually here rather than what they'd expected to find. Why, Reyes said, not a question, a data request. Karath did not answer immediately. He checked the harness tether. The cable was snagged on a fractured rock edge, a clean mechanical problem, addressable. He worked the cable free of the snag in 4 seconds, released the tension, checked that the equipment pack was secured. Can you stand? He said. Reyes evaluated himself. Yes, he stood. He did it carefully, taking weight in stages, not hiding the fact that the left side was compromised, but not making more of it than it was. He stood fully upright, and the expression changed. Still level, still present, but something behind it that was less than entirely composed. The relay station, Karath said. The western access is still open. You can reach it. So can you. I have a notation. My objective is invalidated. Reyes looked at him again with the same direct attention. He was doing something Karath recognized from 11 months of observation. Processing without broadcasting. Taking information in and not putting anything unnecessary out. You didn't have to, Reyes said. The notation was already incurred the moment I turned back. This was accurate. The Academy's beacon registry logged cadet positions in real time. The Proctor review would show Karath's trajectory change. The notation was already on his record. Reyes said nothing for a moment. Then, I'd have done the same. I know, Karath said. Reyes moved. He was faster than Karath expected, given what the harness impact had done to the left side, not at full pace but close, with the compressed efficiency of someone managing pain by not giving it more space than necessary. Karath watched him go, watched the human's silhouette against the plateau's pale rock as he took the corridor's lower gradient at a controlled descent and came up onto the relay station's foundation platform. The third evaluator was at the eastern axis. Reyes reached the western axis 8 seconds ahead of it. Karath watched the objective lock on his kit display. He stood in the western approach corridor with a notation on his culmination trial record and the full knowledge that he had just ended his run at first in the cohort, and he felt something that he spent several seconds identifying because it was not a state he had much experience with. It was not satisfaction. It was not loss. It was not the clean-edged thing his instructor father's stone in his pocket was supposed to represent. It was closer to recognition. The feeling of seeing something clearly after a long time of looking at it wrong. He began the walk back to the extraction point. The extraction point for Sector 3 Alpha was a marked platform at the plateau's western base, where a transit shuttle ran a fixed return circuit every 40 minutes. Karath reached it with 22 minutes to spare before the next circuit. He sat on the platform's equipment bench and ran a post-exertion calibration. 6 other cadets arrived in the next 18 minutes. None of them were Reyes. The relay station was in Sector 5, and the Sector 5 extraction point was on the plateau's opposite side, a longer return route. None of them were Varric Sol, who Karath's last position check showed still waiting at the vent perimeter when the objective locked, which meant the thermal cascade had lasted longer than Varric Sol's time model had accounted for. The cadets who reached Karath's extraction point did not speak to each other. This was standard behavior after a major trial. Each person was processing their own run, reviewing their own decisions, beginning the internal debrief that would continue for days. Karath ran his own. He had made one decision that was outside the parameters of everything he had prepared. He had spent 3 years preparing for the culmination trial, and the preparation had been excellent, and none of it had determined the moment that would define his result. He was not sure what to do with this as an analytical finding. The preparation had been the right thing. The preparation had also been entirely beside the point. He thought about efficiency. He had spent 11 months treating efficiency as the primary variable, minimizing wasted motion, wasted time, wasted attention. All of it organized around the principle that the most effective cadet was the one who lost the fewest resources to unnecessary expenditure. It had produced a record second in the cohort across 3 years of the most demanding program the Academy offered. And then he had turned around in a corridor on the Vethara Plateau and walked back toward a competitor he had spent 11 months trying to outlast, and the efficiency principle had not been the thing that moved his feet. He did not think it was wrong. He thought it was incomplete, something that he had observed in Reyes across 11 months and had not fully understood, because he had been watching it through the frame of competition, cataloging it as a performance variable rather than as a thing in itself, was beginning to come clear in the aftermath of the plateau. Reyes had not run efficient. Reyes had run correct. These were different things, and the difference was not subtle once you stopped conflating them. Efficient was the shortest path to the objective. Correct was the path that accounted for everything the situation actually contained. On the recon platform exercise in month 4, the efficient choice for Reyes's secondary team was to wait for redirect instructions. The correct choice, the one that accounted for the tight time margin, the malfunction's actual behavior, and the crawlway that the rules hadn't excluded, was to move. Reyes had run correct. The proctors had spent 90 minutes deciding whether correct was also permitted, and the answer was yes, because correct usually is. On the Western Approach corridor today, the efficient choice for Karath was to continue to the relay station. The correct choice, the one that accounted for everything the situation actually contained, including the human against the wall and what Karath actually knew about him, had turned out to be something else. He was not certain this was a lesson the Academy intended to teach. The Culmination Trial was designed to test individual performance under pressure. The rules explicitly prohibited inter-cadet assistance. The notation was real and its consequences were real. Karath would not be assigned to the posting his performance metrics alone would have earned him. He would be assigned to a slightly different one. The difference was measurable. He found he could not construct an argument that the measurement was the relevant thing. The shuttle arrived. He boarded with the other 6 cadets and sat in the forward section, watching the plateau recede as the shuttle gained altitude. The thermal venting was visible from above, columns of pale gas rising at intervals along the central ridge, the plateau's geology expressed through the Academy's deliberate incision. Underneath the visual, if you knew to look, were the evaluator units returning to their concealed positions, the scenario's infrastructure resetting itself for the next cohort, the whole apparatus of the trial closing down behind the cadets who had just run it. He thought about the stone in his kit pocket, the weight of what he carried with him. His instructor father had not been talking about rankings. He understood this now with the specificity of a thing learned rather than a thing understood in the abstract. He had known, in the theoretical sense that intelligent people know things without knowing them, that the Academy's design was not purely meritocratic in the narrow sense, that it was testing something broader than performance metrics, had always been testing something broader. The instructor's quiet attention to Reyes across 3 years had been evidence of this. The scenario design, which created conditions where the technical rule answer and the correct answer could diverge. The notation system, which did not mark an inter-cadet assistance as a violation but as a datum, a data point present in the record, available to any posting board that cared to look at it and decide what it meant. Karath had looked at it the wrong way for 11 months. The shuttle landed at the Academy's main transit hub. Cadets dispersed toward their blocks. Karath walked back to Cadet Block 7 in the afternoon light of the Academy's climate system, a pale gold that was nothing like the sky of his home world and that he had stopped noticing within the first 3 months and had never started noticing again until right now, on the walk back from the trial he had just partially failed and partially done correctly. The corridor on the 3rd tier was quiet. Most cadets in his block were still on the plateau or in transit. He went to his room and stood at the desk where he had sat the night before, looking at the dark display and the documents and the stone. and he thought about what came next. The notation would be in his record by evening. The posting assignments would not be finalized for another 30 days. The Academy processed culmination results across a full review period before issuing final placements. He had 30 days in which his record was what it was, complete and unalterable, and the posting board would look at it and make a determination that was above his current ability to influence. He was not concerned about this in the way he would have expected to be. He was thinking about Reyes. He was thinking about something Reyes had said in the corridor. Not the tactical assessments about the evaluator and the access points, which had been the kind of clear, rapid processing that Cadet had catalogued many times, and still respected despite himself. He was thinking about the moment after those assessments. He had said, "I know," and Reyes had not responded with anything, just turned and moved. But in the moment before he moved, in the half-second, when the decision to trust what Cadet had said was being made, the human's expression had done something that Cadet had not seen it do before. It had opened. That was the only word that was accurate. The careful, attentive, processing expression that Reyes carried as his default, the one Cadet had watched across yards and training floors and briefing rooms for 11 months, had opened for a half-second, and underneath it was something less managed. Not gratitude exactly, because gratitude implied the recipient had expected less, and Cadet did not think Reyes operated on lowered expectations. Something more like recognition. The same species of feeling Cadet had identified in himself on the plateau, the feeling of seeing something clearly that had been obscured by the frame you'd been holding in front of it. Cadet sat down at the desk. He opened the desk's document interface and began composing the post-trial self-evaluation that the Academy required from every cadet within 24 hours of a major exercise. The format was fixed: a summary of decisions made, an assessment of outcomes versus intentions, a notation of any departures from planned approach, and the reasoning behind them. It was designed to make cadets reflect accurately on their own performance rather than rationalize it. He filled in the summary section with the precision he brought to everything: the route choices, the timing windows, the evaluator tracking, the probability model's partial success and partial failure. He reached the departures section and paused. The Academy's self-evaluation format had a subfield for inter-cadet interactions that occurred during the trial. The field's label was neutral. It said inter-cadet interactions and offered a text box. The notation was already in the formal record. The self-evaluation was asking for something different. It was asking what he thought had happened and why. He typed for a long time. He wrote about the corridor and the sound and the stopped movement and the calculation that had not resolved cleanly because the calculation had been missing a variable he had not known to include. He wrote about 11 months of observation and the inadequacy of the frame he had applied to it. He wrote about efficiency and correctness and the difference between them, working it out in the text the way he had worked it out on the shuttle ride and the walk back, refining it toward the most accurate version he could produce. He did not write about his instructor father's stone. That was not the Academy's business. He submitted the evaluation and sat for a moment in the quiet of the room. His kit display showed the cohorts running extraction confirmations, cadets checking in at their respective extraction points, the plateau's population thinning as the afternoon wore on. He watched the feed without urgency, noting names as they confirmed. Varixol had extracted from Sector 3 at the southern point, delayed but out. Most of the Sector 5 cadets were confirming in the late afternoon window. Reyes confirmed at the 17th hour from Sector 5's primary extraction point. The kit display logged the confirmation with the standard data: time, position, biometric status within acceptable range, no beacon activation, objective completed. Cadet looked at the confirmation for a moment, then closed the display. He was aware that he did not know what came next between himself and Reyes. The trial was over. The program's formal structure, which had organized their relationship as competitive cadets in the same cohort, was effectively concluded. Posting assignments would separate them into different duty stations, different operational theaters, different institutional contexts. It was entirely possible that they would not be in the same room again for years. It was also possible, Given the size of the galaxy and the relatively small number of postings at the level their records qualified them for, that they would be. He did not know what he would say if they were. He thought about the recon platform exercise and the 90-minute proctor review and the notation in Reyes's record that was neither praise nor censure, simply a data point. He thought about the corridor and his own notation and the relay station objective locked on the kit display 8 seconds before the evaluator reached the eastern axis. He thought about what it meant that Reyes had done exactly what Cadet had said he would do, had moved immediately, had not spent the time confirming the gesture or unpacking it, and had reached the objective. The most accurate thing Cadet could identify about Damon Reyes after 11 months of systematic observation was this: the human did not compete in the direction Cadet had been watching for. He was trying to outlast his rivals or engineer their failures or accumulate a margin that couldn't be closed. He was trying to do the thing correctly, and the board position was a consequence of this rather than the point of it. Cadet had spent 11 months watching a man aim for a target he couldn't see because he'd been watching the board instead. This was not a comfortable thing to know about oneself. It was, however, accurate, and Cadet had always preferred accuracy over comfort. It was one of the things that had made him good at what he was doing. It was also, he was beginning to understand, one of the things that had made him limited in a way he was not going to be limited in the same way again. He stood. He went to the window. The Academy's evening cycle was beginning, the lighting shifting from its neutral afternoon tone to the particular blue-white that marked the transition to night operations for the nocturnal cycle species in the blocks below. The yard was quiet. A few cadets moved along the walkways between blocks, most of them moving with the particular economy of people who were done for the day and knew it. He saw Reyes cross the yard below. The human was moving at a pace that accounted for the left side, slightly favored, not pronounced, the kind of compensation that meant it hurt but was not being permitted to be more than a mechanical problem. He was carrying his kit pack, which meant he had come directly from the transit shuttle rather than stopping at his room first. He was moving in the direction of the medical bay, which was the correct place to go when a harness impact had done what this one had done. He was not moving quickly, but he was moving with the consistency Cadet had cataloged across 11 months, each step a small correct decision, adding up to the destination. Cadet watched him until he turned the corner at the base of Block 4 and was no longer visible. He did not know if Reyes had looked up. He picked up his instructor father's stone from the desk, turned it in his hand once, and set it in the bottom of his kit pack. Not because he was done with it, because it was a carried thing and the weight of it was accurate. He had been second in the cohort for 11 months. He was not certain second was the right word anymore for what he had been, or for what either of them was. The ranking board measured one dimension. The Academy's trial design in its 37 years had been asking a different question, had always been asking it, and today was the first day Cadet had answered in a way that was not simply about the board. He had turned around in a corridor on the Vethara Plateau and walked back toward the person he had spent 11 months treating as an obstacle, and the person had stood up and moved and completed the objective. That was the outcome. It was in the record, notations and all, and it would remain there. The posting board would see it and make of it what they made of it, and Cadet would report to wherever they sent him and do that work with the same attention he had brought to everything. But he thought, in the quiet of the room above the empty yard, that if they sent him to the same place as Reyes, or even if they didn't, if it was years before their paths crossed in the operational maze of the galaxy's service infrastructure, he would know what to say. He had spent 11 months not looking at the right thing. He was looking at it now. He was ready. The next morning, the Academy held its post-trial briefing in the main hall, a formality, attendance required, designed to transition the cohort from the operational mindset of the trial back to the institutional mindset of what came after. Cadet arrived 8 minutes early. He took a seat in the mid-tier rows, not at the front where the highest scorers traditionally position themselves as a kind of social claim, not at the back where the cadets who had struggled went to avoid the proctor's line of sight. He sat in the middle and waited. Proctor Vasha Lane ran the briefing. She did not announce results. Those would come through the formal record update. 30 days of review before the posting assignments were finalized. What she did was something Karath had not fully attended to in previous post-trial briefings because he had been sitting in the front rows, processing his own data. She talked about the trial as a system. The Vethara Plateau has hosted the Culmination Trial for 37 years, she said. In that time, no scenario combination has produced a cohort in which every cadet performed optimally. This is not a design flaw. It is the design. The plateau is built to create conditions in which the technically correct decision and the situationally correct decision diverge, and to observe what cadets do when they find themselves at that divergence. She paused. The hall was quiet in the way large rooms full of people are quiet when everyone has simultaneously decided not to make noise. 42 years ago, the Academy's founder made a statement in the program's design documentation that we do not post anywhere in the facility because posting it would change what it tests. I will tell you what it says because you have now completed the trial and the information can no longer alter your results. She wrote, "The indicator we are selecting for is not the decision under pressure. Any well-trained cadet can make decisions under pressure. The indicator is the frame the cadet applies when determining what the pressure situation actually contains. Narrow frames produce narrow decisions. Wide frames produce wide ones. The plateau cannot teach a cadet to widen their frame. It can only show us who already has." She closed the document on her display. "Your records reflect what the plateau showed us. The posting board will read them accordingly." Dismissed. Karath sat for a moment after the cadets around him began to move. He was thinking about the word frame, the accurate word for the thing he had been examining. The frame through which he had watched Reyes across 11 months was competitive, narrow, oriented toward the board position and the metrics that produced it. The frame through which Reyes appeared to operate was something wider, wide enough to include the secondary team in the crawlway under the platform, a junior cadet under a scaffold, and a Vreth rival in a corridor who had turned back without explanation, wide enough to include Karath himself as something more than an obstacle. He filed that away. The briefing hall was clearing. He rose and moved with the flow toward the corridor outside, and as he turned the corner into the main passageway, he came face to face with Reyes, who was apparently leaving by the same exit on the same schedule. The human had a pressure wrap visible above his collar on the left side, where the harness impact had hit. His expression when he saw Karath was the familiar, unhurried one. But something in the set of it was different from the baseline Karath had spent 11 months cataloging. The careful management was present, but so was the thing underneath it that had opened briefly in the corridor. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The hall traffic moved around them. Then Reyes said, in the dry level register that was his natural mode, "I put it in my self-evaluation." Karath did not need to ask what he meant, so did I. The proctor's going to want to cross-reference them. I expect so. Another moment. A cadet from the Lossian cohort angled past them, not looking, absorbed in his own debrief. The passageway filled and thinned with the hall's exit flow. "I've been trying to figure out what I missed," Reyes said. He said it with the same matter-of-fact tone he brought to tactical assessments, which Karath had come to recognize as how the human sounded when he was being most honest. "About you. For most of the year, I knew you were running something in the study networks. The pattern was obvious once I started watching. What I couldn't read was whether it was deliberate or just cohort dynamics." Karath considered this. "Deliberate," he said, "because accuracy was the standard. I was competitive in a way that was not well calibrated." Reyes looked at him with the direct attention. "I figured eventually. I didn't file on it because I thought filing would make it permanent in a way that not filing wouldn't." That was correct. Maybe. The human's expression held something that was approximately wry, which on his face was a very small thing, barely visible. Or maybe I just didn't want the fight. That is also possible. The traffic in the passageway had thinned to a trickle. They were nearly alone in it. Karath registered this as a fact, that the hall had emptied around them while they were talking, which meant neither of them had been tracking it, and noted it as another data point outside the parameters of his standard operating model. "The posting board has 30 days, Reyes said. "Yes. They'll put us at different stations. They always separate the top 2 or 3 from each cohort. geographic spread of qualified postings. The historical data supports that, Karath agreed, though my record now contains elements that were not in the historical model. He meant the notation. He said it without apology, because he did not feel apology was the accurate response to something he would make the same choice on if the situation recurred. Reyes heard the absence of apology and said nothing for a moment, then, mine too. The crawlway in month 4 is in there, the Loshin Cadet from the simulator in month 7. The scaffold incident. Karath had noted all of those. He had catalogued them as performance deviations from the competitive model. He understood now that the posting board would catalog them as exactly what Vash Align's founder had described. Evidence of the frame width. Evidence of what the plateau was measuring. They will read yours differently than mine, Karath said. Maybe. The small wry thing again. Or maybe they'll read them together and put us in the same room anyway. Stranger things. The passageway was empty now except for the two of them and the ambient hum of the Academy's environmental systems. Outside, through a narrow clerestory window high on the wall, the Academy's morning light was doing what it did. The pale gold that Karath had stopped noticing within the first 3 months and had not fully started noticing again until the walk back from the plateau yesterday. He was noticing it now. This seemed, on balance, like an improvement. I have not said this correctly at any point this year, Karath said. I should have assessed you as a cadet in the cohort rather than as a target variable. The methodology was wrong in the frame I applied and in the specific actions it produced. He said this the way he said accurate things, precisely, without ornamentation, without the softening that made an apology feel better to deliver than to receive. Reyes absorbed it. The careful, attentive expression held. Accepted, he said, not with generosity, not with the particular warmth that some species deployed around reconciliation as a social lubricant. With the same matter-of-fact register that meant he was being most honest. It was the right tone. It made the acceptance mean something. They stood in the empty passageway for another moment. Then the building's scheduling tone chimed. The third period assembly signal, and the moment closed the way moments do when an institutional rhythm reclaims the space they were briefly using. Reyes turned toward Block 4. Karath turned toward Block 7. At the corridor junction, without particular ceremony, each went the direction they were going. The posting assignments came 28 days later, ahead of the standard 30-day window, an unusual pace that the administrative staff attributed to this cohort's unusually clean results across the review period. Karath received his assignment at the 7th hour in his room on the same kit display where he had spent 11 months watching Reyes's name above his own. The assignment was to the Vethara Command Station, a joint species posting on the outer administrative ring of the sector. Senior Probationary Field Officer, Tactical Analysis Division. The role suited his profile precisely. The kind of posting the metrics would have predicted for the second-place finisher in a competitive cohort with a strong modeling background, also assigned to the Vethara Command Station Tactical Operations Division, Reyes, D. Karath looked at the posting confirmation for a long moment. He thought about the historical data on separation of top cohort finishers. He thought about the passageway and Vash Align's founder's frame-width sentence and the posting board that had read the cross-referenced self-evaluations and made a determination outside the historical model. He already knew what he would say to Reyes when the time came. He had known since the corridor. He closed the confirmation and notified his family. His instructor father would have a response ready, as he always did, prepared, measured, present to the actual situation rather than the expected one. That was the standard. Karath had spent 3 years learning it. He had spent 11 months learning. He wasn't there yet. He was ready to start.